Hello and welcome back to the Human Services Costing and Pricing Resource Package. This is training video number 2, Costing and Pricing Governance. My name's David Gilchrist. Before we get into the substance of this video, let's just make sure we're navigating in the right way. So video number 1, Introduction, is a video that you should have already looked at before you came to video 2, Costing and Pricing, which is this current video. The next video is Costing and Pricing Principles, and video 4 is looking at the Microsoft Excel costing models themselves. All of these videos are really just introducing key principles and making key comments, but it's really important that you think about the broader resources that are available as well. Just for your information, the 5th video in this series is looking at costing and government procurement. So a video designed to support those people that are involved on the government side purchasing services from the not-for-profit and charitable human services sector to be able to support them in understanding and driving sustainability in the government's interests as well as in the human services interests, as well as in the broader community interest, of course, which we're all really interested in. To that extent, let's have a look at the agenda then for this particular video. Importantly, in this video, we are reinforcing comments that are made in the Costing and Pricing for Human Services framework and also in the modelling handbooks. And like other videos, there are tabs designed to give you page numbers so that you can go back to these resources and read more deeply about the points that are made as we go through this video. Remember, you can always put the video on hold, pause it for a while, go back to these resources, look at the resources, and make sure you feel confident in terms of what we're saying before you move forward. To that extent, in this video, we'll have a look at sustainability and how sustainability might be described in the context of human services provision in Australia. We'll talk about the purpose of costing and pricing, and particularly cost-benefit considerations that boards, CEOs and others should take into account when they're thinking about costing and pricing in their organisations. We'll talk about the rewards and risks related to costing and pricing, and we'll also introduce the idea of the relevant range, and this is dealt with, again, more deeply, particularly in the Costing and Pricing for Human Services framework, but the relevant range is a really important consideration because that is the range of activity, the number of activities that you undertake, where the assumptions that you're making about costing and pricing hold true. So I'll talk about this a bit more deeply in a few minutes, but at the end of the day, it's really important to understand that costing and pricing is only relevant or true in terms of the assumptions you make for certain relevant ranges. Again, we'll come back to that shortly. And then the final section in this presentation relates to key governance considerations. What should boards and others think about or consider in the context of controlling what's going on as a result of costing and pricing and reporting what's going on in that context as well. So let's get into it. Before we do anything further though, I want to talk about the context that drives the way we've approached the development of these resources in relation to these particular topics. First and foremost, I think we would all agree that boards have a limited capacity in relation to setting prices and achieving profit outcomes. We need to take into consideration the reality of the situation for not-for-profit and charitable organisations. And I'll talk about, for instance, reconciling your desired price, the desired funding that you're looking for, as compared to the actual funding being achieved from either governments or from philanthropists in relation to a particular program. But we need to be realistic that boards have limited capacity here, CEOs and others have limited capacity, and so costing and pricing is not necessarily about arbitrarily saying what the funding should be, but rather about understanding the financial implications of accepting contracts that might not be providing the funding that you calculate you need to cover off your comprehensive cost of service delivery and achieve the profits that you need to achieve. I'll come back to this thought shortly, but just to, I guess, bolster the challenge there, and that is to recognise that, of course, the board has the ultimate responsibility for the sustainability of the organisation. I'll describe sustainability next, but to that extent, I guess the more the board knows about the financial performance and financial capacity of their organisation, the more ability they have to respond to external pressures and control their environment. In other words, as I mentioned a moment ago, costing and pricing is about building understanding of your organisation so that you can intellectually respond to these challenges, and particularly, of course, decide whether or not to either undertake the provision of a new program of services and supports, or indeed to continue a current program of services and supports. If you're not being able to be funded appropriately, and you have no way of mitigating the funding shortfall, in other words, covering the gap that is established as a result of that poor funding, then it might be that you actually discontinue providing services in order to ensure the ongoing financial sustainability of your organisation. So to that extent, ultimately the decision as to whether to continue doing something or not lies with the board, and to that further extent, the board must decide then whether it is financially sustainable to agree to a particular contract price. So this is the context within which we're going to approach costing and pricing broadly in this set of resources, and particularly in the context of this video. So let's have a look then at sustainability first and foremost, our understanding of what that really means. Often when we talk about sustainability, particularly financial sustainability, people infer or consider that that relates to the organisation surviving. Survivorship or survivability is often linked to financial sustainability because, and obviously, if you don't make enough money and you can't pay your bills, then you won't survive as an organisation. Most people would accept that. But in fact, we take a definition of sustainability that we think is much more applicable in the context of human services provision, and also in the context of the relationship between governments, not-for-profits and charities and philanthropists, because at the end of the day, we all want to see, and a guiding principle of this project is that we all see the ongoing capacity to deliver services as representing sustainability. To that extent then, when we think about sustainability, we need to ensure that we are maintaining the quantity of services and supports required by the community at the quality that's appropriate to those services and supports, and in the timing that's appropriate to those services and supports. Taken together, these three things being maintained constitutes financial sustainability. If an individual organisation or the sector as a whole, so the system, is not able to continue to deliver under one of those headings or a combination of those headings, then the sector or the individuals aren't sustainable. So if an individual organisation can no longer deliver the same quantity of services at the quality and timing that it's always delivered, then it's not sustainable, even if it's still here, even if it's still able to pay its bills. It's not sustainable because the service reliability in the community is detrimentally impacted. So indeed, we would essentially say that in relation to sustainability, if there's a reduction in these elements, either one or a combination of these elements, then there's a reduction in sustainability. And this is what we want to cost and price to try and recognise and avoid. To that extent, it's important to remember too that reductions in sustainability can be the first signs of insolvency. So if an organisation has to go through a process of reducing what it provides or the quality or timing of that provision, then it might be that that organisation's also suffering a more significant financial challenge that might lead to insolvency in the extreme situation. The other thing that this idea suggests is that any organisation must make a profit to be sustainable in a market economy. And this is also a challenge to many in governments, in philanthropy, as well as in the not-for-profit and charitable sector, because people have a feeling that not-for-profit shouldn't make a profit. But in fact, not-for-profits are titled not-for-profit because the members are not intended to make a financial profit out of being members of the organisation. The organisations themselves are entirely entirely legally can make a profit, but indeed they need to make a profit to maintain that sustainability over the short, medium and longer term. Let's have a look at that in a slightly different way. When we think about sustainability, we need to think about solvency in the short term. And most people think financial sustainability, they think about being able to pay your bills as and when they fall due. A really, really important thing for directors, for CEOs and for others, and an absolutely critical target of sustainability in the first instance. To be able to be sustainable, we need to have sufficient cash flow or working capital to ensure that we can pay those bills while we're waiting for our funders to pay their invoices to us. So in other words, to be able to ensure that we've got sufficient cash to be able to pay those bills as and when they fall due. In the midterm, though, we also need to think about sustainability from a stability perspective, which means that the organisation in the midterm can continue to be able to provide services that meet that quantity, quality and timing litmus test that we've just discussed. And to that extent, organisations need to be able to pay bills that were incurred in previous periods and often even incurred at a lesser cost than that which they're going to have to pay when they actually realise those expenses. So a great example of this issue is employee entitlements, where organisations need to make a profit in year one in order to be able to pay employee entitlements like annual leave or long service leave at some future date, but at a higher rate than that in which the employee earned that benefit at the time it was taken. If the organisation doesn't make a profit in year one, by the time, or in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, by the time it gets to year 5 and has to pay employee entitlements such as long service leave or what have you, then the organisation doesn't have the reserves on the balance sheet to be able to do that. So profitability is about building the capacity of the balance sheet so that over time the organisation has sufficient funds to be able to pay those types of expenses. But equally, in the longer term, organisations need to maintain sustainability, which means that the organisation can meet the sustainability definition that we've just talked about, that is, maintain the quantity, quality and timing of service and support delivery, by being able to replace assets, invest in the organisation to meet changing circumstances, particularly policy and regulatory changes, and to ensure that the organisation remains fit for purpose in the context of pursuing its mission. To that extent, things like replacing assets or responding to policy changes, meeting regulatory changes, and also being able to train and manage staff over the longer term are all elements of sustainability that need to be considered. And once again, being profitable each year is critical to building the balance sheet to be able to make these investments in due course. So costing and pricing is a critical element, because in costing and pricing, we can determine the extent to which the profitability of the organisation, the funding of the organisation is sufficient not just to pay the comprehensive costs of service delivery as they are today, but to be able to ensure that organisation can continue to be sustainable in the mid to longer term. So let's have a look then at the purpose of costing and pricing to support our comments in this regard. First and foremost, the purpose of costing and pricing is to ensure you understand the comprehensive cost of service delivery, so that organisations can intellectually decide whether or not they're going to accept a contract from government. And if they accept a contract from government that actually doesn't deliver the comprehensive cost of service delivery plus profit, as we've just discussed, then that the organisation is able to manage that there's a rationale also for accepting that contract, because it's not just for financial purposes that organisations accept contracts. There could be a purpose or object reason for doing that. There could be a political or other reason that drives you to do that. The issue is not to say that if you don't make a profit, you shouldn't do it. The issue is to say that intellectually you understand the ramifications of the contract, and you also have a plan in place to mitigate the impact of that contract. So you might not make a profit out of program one, but make sufficient profit out of program 2 to be able to support that ongoing financial sustainability that we talked about. The other purpose of costing and pricing that's critical to understand is it allows you to establish a target price for your services and supports. What funding do you need, in your view, to achieve all of those elements of financial sustainability that we talked about? And then if you know what your comprehensive cost of service delivery is, you know what your target price is, or your funding objective for that particular program is, you can compare that target price with the price offered by funders, so that's governments and philanthropists, to be able to understand what the funding gap might be, the extent of that funding gap, and then to be able to make plans about how either you close that gap or you come to the realisation that in fact you can't continue to deliver that service. To that extent, the fourth purpose of costing and pricing then is to allow the board, the CEO and others to make a decision as to whether you're comfortable contracting to deliver under that offered price, having identified the gap between what you need and what you're offered. This is fundamentally the context, the issue that we're looking to resolve by developing these particular resources and developing the capacity to be able to understand the process to arrive at this decision-making capacity. But what about pricing and profit? This is a really important consideration as well, because organisations aren't used to being able to establish a price and profit, but also they're not like commercial organisations where often there's an accepted profit level established within certain industries, say the banking industry or what have you. Whereas in not-for-profit and charitable organisations, there's a tradition, if you like, of almost breaking even or having very small profits rather than thinking about the profit actually supporting that sustainability. So in terms of pricing and profit then, I'll reiterate that any organisation operating in a market economy must make a profit, even if it's a charity or a not-for-profit organisation. It must make a profit to maintain that long-term sustainability that we talked about. To make a profit, you need to understand your comprehensive cost of service delivery, and then you have to apply a markup. And there's a number of ways of arriving at an appropriate markup for your organisation. One way may be to use CPI as an indicator of markup, because CPI might be a great proxy for expansion in the economy, and you want to ensure that your spending capacity as an organisation is maintained in the context of that economic expansion. You might use GDP for the same purposes. That also can represent expansion in the economy, and that might be a good yardstick to work out whether or not you're making sufficient profit to at least maintain your balance sheet spending strength against the economic growth. But another and third way to do it might be to create an understanding of your financial needs in the short, medium and longer term. That is, to understand how much money you need this year for the investments and for the operations that you're going to have, next year for the investments and operations you're going to have, and in the longer term for investments and operations that you're going to have. Typically, the strategic plan is a good guide here, because the strategic plan will encompass the kinds of investments that you need to make, the kinds of assets that you want to buy, etc., etc. But what happens typically is that organisations create a budget for an annual financial plan for the organisation, but typically don't develop an ongoing plan that is commensurate or aligns with the strategic plan. And so to that extent, we think not only do you cost and price, but you need to develop a 3 to 5 year financial plan for your organisation that actually sets out the operating income and expenditure over those years, and the capital income and expenditure over those years that are required to ensure your organisation continues to be able to maintain sustainability in the way that we've defined it. We also think you need to calculate the target price. That is the funding level or price that you need to charge in order to ensure the financial sustainability of your organisation in the longer term. So calculating your target price for each individual program is important to make sure that overall the organisation is going to achieve a profitable outcome that supports the financial imposts that are going to be charged and the structural and other investments that need to be made over the short, medium and longer term. To that extent, we have to acknowledge, of course, that the target price is unlikely to be achieved. And I think we need to be less than naive by saying that at the end of the day, we might have a target price, we might have a target profit, but we don't necessarily achieve that outcome because we know that there are funding shortfalls embedded in the system that are going to make it very difficult for governments to change what they do and difficult for organisations to be able to accept it. The key issue is to understand that target price and to understand the target price gap, what we call the target price gap. How might we calculate that? Typically, we create the target price. So that's undertaking the costing and pricing process and setting out our target price for individual programs to ensure that we understand that we are sustainable in the way that we've already mentioned or talked about. From that, we subtract the achieved price, which is the price that's actually provided by the funder, whether a government or a philanthropist. At the end of the day, the achieved price is typically less than the target price. But on the other hand, if it was more than the target price, then we would have a positive target price gap and we would find that we would be happy with regard to sustainability going forward because we're not only making a profit, we're making money ahead of our profit or in excess of our profit. To that extent, then, our job is to look at the target price gap, which is the difference between the target price and the achieved price, or the excess of cost and markup, or selling at less than cost. In other words, what are we saying here? You need to be able to understand at a program level and at an organisational level the degree to which there is a gap between what you need to charge to achieve that sustainability outcome and what is actually being provided to you by governments or philanthropists in order to understand and then respond to those gaps. And those responses could be that some elements are going to bring in more money than other elements that you're providing or programs that you're providing. Some responses might be that you simply don't continue with programs that have been funded up to that point because they're costing the organisation too much. You might also use this method to be able to determine whether or not you take on a new program. And that's a really important consideration to take as well. So that at the end of the day, it's about being intellectually able to make sound decisions and to take risks, if you like, about the future of the organisation and what's going to happen. So what are some of the cost benefits then of considerations to take into account when we're costing and pricing? Well, there's a few things to be thinking about here, but remember that when you embark on a costing and pricing exercise, you need to be as accurate as possible, but remembering that costing and pricing comes at a cost. It costs you time and money to be able to undertake this process. And therefore, while you might be inclined to try and cost and price to the very last cent, it might be that you should be thinking about this process at a higher, less costly levels to make sure that at the end of the day, the cost of this process is outweighed by the benefits that the information provides. In other words, if we go back to that previous slide, where we talked about costing to arrive at your target price and then to compare that to your achieved price, we don't necessarily have to cost everything down to the final red cent. We're trying to work out the extent to which that target price gap is going to inhibit our sustainability in the short, medium and longer term and to respond accordingly to that. That's the information that we require. The costing process provides a benefit by providing that information. To that extent, then, we need to ensure that the cost-benefit consideration is thought about in terms of how much it costs to do something, how much time is taken up to do that particular costing process, and also what the opportunity cost is for those staff in terms of other things that they might do that have greater benefit to the organisation. To that extent, then, the cost in time and money incurred in costing and pricing be outweighed by the value of the information developed? Now, remember, only you and your organisation can make that determination, remembering sustainability issues, remembering board responsibilities. You need to balance all of those things to make sure that at the end of the day, this is going to be a benefit to your organisation. There are also some rewards, though, to costing and pricing that are important to think about. Specifically, when we cost and price, we have an increased understanding of the financial sustainability of our organisation. We also have better communication within the organisation because we're able to say better what we need to have happen to ensure that sustainability going forward. We can also demonstrate to staff and others what's working and what's not working, and also report in terms of improvements that might occur when you react to that information, when you actually put policies and procedures in place that are designed to mitigate the problems that you might be having financially. To that extent, then, you have better decision making at the board level, at the executive level, and also at the operational level. Better risk analysis as well. So not only do we identify that target price gap, we also identify the drivers of expenses that might not be covered in the funding processes. So when we think about things like funders that say cap administrative components, there might be a significant risk associated with that you need to take into consideration. The final point that I think is really important in relation to costing and pricing is it does improve mission focus, because you need to cost and price to support your mission. Often that mission is not funded as well as it could be, and therefore you might have to make other decisions about how you approach your mission, how you approach your funding, and perhaps get involved in other programs or other services to make sure that you're being as sustainable economically as possible. All of these things then lead to greater sustainability for your organisation, because you're making what we call intellectually focused decisions that are based on information that allow you to do the things that you need to do. There's also risks, though, in relation to costing and pricing that you need to be aware of and take into consideration. For instance, when we cost and price, we base our assumptions, our forecasts on history, but costing and pricing is a prediction. So while our history might tell us one thing about what the future looks like, we can't really tell what the future is going to be. That's going to be something that happens to us, and there could be all sorts of impacts from changes in the economy or what have you that are going to change the outcomes associated with your costing and pricing. For instance, if you have another COVID or another GFC, there'll be some significant impacts in terms of the way your organisation finds itself in financial sustainability terms. But there can also be some more micro or smaller elements that change your financial sustainability over time as well. For instance, in relation to IT, it has been traditional in this sector for organisations to apply for grants to purchase IT software from lotteries organisations or from philanthropists or from government departments. You apply for the grant, you receive the grant, you buy the software, and you don't have to worry about replacing that software for 5 or so years until it becomes redundant. At the end of the day, though, that's changing, as I'm sure everyone's aware, where software is now subscribed to. So your cost base is changing, and that cost base is becoming more expensive, but also it has implications for your operating costs as opposed to your capital costs. So again, while your costing and pricing is based on history of what's gone before, it's actually predicting what's happening into the future, and those things don't always remain the same. Activity expectations can also be unfounded. So when we cost and price, we're not just predicting what the costs are going to be, we're predicting what the number of activities, so what the number of iterations of services or supports are going to be that we're going to be providing. And those expectations can be unfounded in the sense that we might think that we're going to deliver the same number of services this year as we did last year, but find that we can't do that for whatever reason, as a result of change in society, a change in need, a change in our capacity to deliver services. We also might find that our activity timing is mispredicted. That is, our costs might be uniformly costed over the year, but we find now that there's seasonality in terms of the services we provide. And we need to take that into consideration too in terms of cash flow to make sure that our overheads are covered and so on. Finally, we might find that there are other environmental effects that impact those outcomes. As I mentioned before, talking about basing our costing and pricing on history, our predictions might be impacted by economic, human resources, so workforce challenges and so on, all challenges that the sector's facing now that might get better or might get worse and therefore impact the outcome associated with costing and pricing. All of these elements then suggest that it's really crucial to have timely reporting in respect of costs and not cost predicted and cost impacted, so really costs achieved, activity levels predicted as opposed to activity levels actually delivered, and timing of those activity levels. We need to get timely reporting so that as those predictions become true or become found to be false, we can make policy and practice outcomes to mitigate the impacts of those things. The other area that I said I would talk about was the relevant range, and this is dealt with in much more depth in Framework page 43, so it might be worth stopping the video here, so pausing for a moment and reading relevant range section within the framework to make sure that you feel confident with it. But importantly, all of the ideas that I've just talked about are only applicable within the relevant range of the organisation. That is, as activity volume changes, you might find that not just variable costs change, but fixed costs also change. So if you have very significant changes in your volume, then you might need, for instance, to have a second general manager appointed, or you might need to have a bigger office, you might need to have more payroll staff or other staff. All of those things occur when there's a change in relevant range. So the relevant range actually consists of, or is defined as, that activity level within which your assumptions and your calculations relating to costing and pricing hold true. If you double your activity level, then probably your assumptions and your calculations aren't going to hold true. And so you have to re-evaluate your costing and pricing in that situation. In that context, we have economies and diseconomies of scale. So economies of scale occur when you are pushing your activity levels as high as you can within the relevant range to ensure that you cover all of your overheads, that you are actually recovering all of your costs and making appropriate profit. A diseconomy of scale occurs, on the other hand, where you are increasing your activity to such an extent that you have to increase your overheads to be able to meet that productive output. And that is a diseconomy because you might not be getting sufficient funding to be able to cover off those additional overheads, such as increased head office space, increased payroll, etc., that I mentioned before. This is an important consideration in the context of what we call tactical and strategic accounting decision making. How do we make decisions to grow our organisation, but remember that growing the organisation doesn't just result in more output, it does result in greater costs, both of a fixed nature and of a variable nature. Let's look at this graphically just to see if that helps to explain the situation. So in terms of relevant range, this graph, and obviously it's just an example put together to give you a bit of a sense, is a graph that on the x-axis we have dollars, so the costs associated going up that axis, and on the y-axis we have the activity level, so the numbers of activities increase. If we had an aged care facility, we would perhaps fall under that very first group of relevant range in the left-hand side of the graph. So we have leased a aged care facility of 40 beds, but we want to increase our output. And so we decide to lease another 40-bed aged care facility, which takes us into that second relevant range section, so the middle section of this graph, because we now have to pay more lease fees, we now have to pay more insurance and so on. But importantly, we might not fill that facility, we might not have full occupancy of that facility for some time. And so our profitability, our financial sustainability will be impacted negatively while we work hard to get that second aged care facility fully occupied. And then the same occurs in the third element. When we go to our third aged care facility, we have another increase in overheads that we need to take into consideration, but remembering we may only get 1 or 2 new occupants a week or a day or a fortnight until we're actually fully occupied as well. And therefore, we're increasing costs, but not necessarily increasing income. To that extent, it's important to remember that one more client might require you to have an increase in management capacity. You might have increased rent and leasing costs. You might have increased staffing ratios, and you might have more motor vehicles. Regulatory arrangements about staffing ratios impact this, say in the case of childcare. Leasing costs, regulatory costs, more motor vehicles all add to the overhead cost of the organisation, but you're not necessarily getting the income that you need. So this is a really important consideration, relevant range. And as I say, I think it's worth going back to the framework to make sure that you feel confident with this particular idea as you go into the costing and pricing process. Okay, let's have a look at some key governance considerations then in relation to this area. I guess first and foremost, we want to make sure that we have a proportionate response in terms of our objects and our strategy priorities in the context of costing and pricing, making sure that we're responding to the risks, the dangers that the costing and pricing process might identify, but ensuring also that we are continuing to pursue our objects and strategy. We might need to reevaluate the types of information, the format and priorities of reporting that go to the board, that go to the executive, that go to operational managers and others, to make sure we're getting the right information to react to changes in the costs of the organisation that we hadn't predicted or poor predictions. To that extent, we might also need to think about delineating our activities. So what is it that what numbers of activities for each program do we want to see happen? How many activities do we absolutely have to deliver in order to break even? And how many activities do we need to deliver in order to cover all of our costs, much less make a profit? To that extent, we want to establish some key alarm trigger points in the case that activities are so low that we might be concerned about solvency or sustainability in the short term, much less the medium and longer term. We also need to make sure that the board's engaged fully, that they understand the organisation and understand the costing and pricing assumptions and the processes that have been put in place. This is critical and very difficult in a board situation where you have volunteer board members, for instance, and it's really something to be thinking about as you enter the costing and pricing process. Has the board got the time, the focus, and also do we need to invest in training to support the board members to be able to understand what's needed? The fifth element that I think is really crucial here is having an integrated approach so that we have 3 to 5 year strategic plan, a 3 to 5 year financial plan, and annual budgeting, which allows us to frame our costing and pricing and also to look at costing and pricing over the next 3 to 5 years and to understand what kinds of financial capacities we're going to need to ensure that we get not only our overheads and all of our costs covered, but we also achieve the profit outcome that we're going to need to have to build our balance sheet to meet those expenses into the future. So to that extent then, control is an essential to the process. That means that control, I reiterate, but it really importantly requires board engagement. It requires internal and external reporting effectively. continuous forecasting. So once you cost and price, you don't set it aside and do something else. You need to continue to check your costing and pricing and make sure that you are responding to changes that you didn't predict, or responding indeed to errors that you might have in your costing and pricing processes. It's important in this process that the organisation has a culture of admitting errors and responding to them, not trying to hide them. There are other control considerations to take into account as well. In that respect, as we mentioned before, the board is ultimately responsible. It's also, though, a source of reasonableness checking in relation to costing and pricing processes, and it should set the parameters and policies relating to this particular process. The board should also receive reports providing the actual cost recovery versus planned or targeted cost recovery associated with your activity levels and your financial reporting processes. To that extent, in terms of financial control, it's important to remember that there needs to be a regular review of the margin being achieved against the margin targeted. So that's the profit. Are we achieving the profit that we wanted, that we need? Are we achieving the profit that we've accepted that we can have as a result of the funding arrangements that are being put in place? We need to also think about that in the context of regular review of effects of under recovery. We've said already that programs might be accepted for other reasons than that they are financially sustainable, and they might not be financially sustainable, but we need to make sure that where we're not recovering costs, where we're not achieving the profit we need to achieve, that at the end of the day, overall, we're still achieving the outcome that we need. Where we have programs that are not profitable, where they are financial costs to the organisation, are we managing and trying to ring fence that cost, keep the cost as low as it can be, to be as efficient as we can be at the end of the day. There's also a need then to think about a regular review of likely future increases previously unidentified. What's changing in the business environment? What's changing in the cost environment that might impact costing and pricing for your organisation? Again, costing and pricing is not set and forget. You have to think about this all the time and think about what's happening in the real world to make sure that costing and pricing is going to be the best it can be in terms of informing your decision making. To that extent, then, development of reporting outcomes and mitigation strategies in terms of those reports where you're not achieving cost recovery, where you're not achieving the profit or achieving the financial sustainability results that you forecast. You need to react to that and put strategies in place to turn that around. Some further cost considerations then include reporting of your cost assumptions. So not just the costing and pricing, not just the budget, but actually telling the board and the CEO and others what the cost assumptions were, what your activity expectations are, and then, of course, what your actual versus expected outcomes have been, both in terms of activities and dollars. You need to appropriate the breakdown, make sure that you have an appropriate breakdown of activity expectation time periods. And I mentioned seasonality before, but making sure that you're able to deliver information in a timely manner so that people can respond to those decision points. And then to create those decision points, when is activity not being realised and the board needs to know? In other words, when are there significant issues that should be provided to the board or made known to the board, and when can the CEO just get on and mitigate things without having to report to the board? This is a really important control consideration. The final element that I wanted to talk about then in terms of this particular video is some of the decision-making principles that might help the board and guide the board and CEO and others in terms of the issues that we've identified. So first and foremost, always seek to be consistent in your calculations. Start with history and move forward, remembering that history just is likely a more likely outcome than anything else, but at the end of the day, you're predicting what's happening. You need to seek to establish true costs within the bounds of usefulness and benefit. So cost-benefit assumption is a really important element there. Identify your assumptions and let board members and others know what they are. Always check for reasonableness and errors and omissions. So you're checking the sheets all the time, you're checking your calculations all the time to make sure they make sense. A second opinion is always a useful thing. There's no harm in having a second opinion, and indeed you can talk to your colleagues in the sector in other organisations by talking in percentages. You don't have to talk about actual numbers, you don't have to disclose state secrets, but you can still compare your performance and expectations with their performance and expectations in different ways. You should focus on the material costs and programs, so those significant costs and programs, the small costs and the small programs that don't really have a financial sustainability impact one way or the other, you probably don't need to cost because you're trying to ensure that the benefits of your costing and pricing process outweigh those costs. Of course, get outside advice if you feel uncomfortable about what you're doing. That might include training, it might include costing and pricing, or a shadowing process where a consultant shadows accountants or others within your organisation to cost and price effectively. But just remembering too that the cost that you need to identify is based on likely actual level of activity, not the capacity of your organisation. Organisations typically can do more than they have done, but don't necessarily achieve that outcome. You're trying to predict what your actual level of activity will be, not what you can do or what you might do or what might be fantastic for your organisation to consider at some point in the future. Thank you very much. It's great to be able to talk to you and to discuss these particular issues. Please send any queries or comments to either myself or to my colleague Paul Flatow in the Centre for Social Impact at UWA, and our websites are here as well. And on those websites you'll find resources, reports and other materials that might support what you're doing. All the best. I'll look forward to talking to you in video number 3.